Hi, this is Esther Lynn, photographer for MMAfighting.com, and I'd like to share some of my favorite images for UFC 200 and all of its surrounding events, including the Ultimate Fighter finale, season 23, and UFC Fight Night 90. Before the start of International Fight Week, I looked out of my hotel room to survey Las Vegas on Independence Day. I saw a huge fireworks display over at the new T-Mobile Arena, where we'd end the longest fight week I have ever experienced with UFC 200. The next morning, we were in the MGM Grand to kick off with open workouts for the Ultimate Fighter finale and Fight Night 90. We begin with strawweight champ Joanna Jędrzejczyk showing off all manner of strikes, and later challenger Claudia Gadelha smashed mitts for the crowd. Lightweight challenger Eddie Alvarez looked poised to capture that crown, while Rafael dos Anjos showed he was ready to defend it, sharing the spotlight with his team and coaches. The next morning, we attended the first of the week's early weigh-ins at 8 a.m., and challenger Eddie Alvarez was one of the first few to hit the scales. The UFC provides snacks, water, and other replenishing items for the fighters as soon as the commission is done recording their weight. These early weigh-ins seem to be embraced by all. Many fighters were ecstatic to get one of the hurdles of fighting out of the way so quickly. The MMA fighting team trekked back to the MGM Grand for the UFC 200 press conference by 10 a.m. in the beautiful Kaw Theater. New setting but familiar scene as Daniel Cormier and Jon Jones picked up right where they left off, lobbing insults across the podium to the amusement of the rest of the panel. Even the usually reserved Cain Velasquez joked around, and the normally aloof Brock Lesnar was highly entertained by all of it. It's only Wednesday, but the main event for UFC 200 was already heated. Both men sporting their respective titles, trying to assert the legitimacy of the gold belts over their shoulders. We're just getting going at noon, as it's time to head over to Media Day to speak to the rest of the fighters on the historic UFC 200 card. They're all good matchups from top to bottom. I just walk around the room, already feeling a bit overwhelmed, stealing little moments, trying to find pockets of good light. At 4, it's time to run over the T-Mobile Arena for the Fight Night 90 ceremonial weigh-ins. I try and see if anyone looks significantly different from the earlier proceedings, and now we get to see them face off. Champ dos Anjos looks significantly healthier, no longer gaunt and tired, and Alvarez appeals to the crowd for support. We head back to the hotel to recap the day. But right before we tape our video recap in the evening, there are whispers of an emergency press conference being held. We sprint to the press room without any information, only panic. Upon entering the ballroom, I listen to Dana White lay out the facts in front of this immense black curtain that seems to steal the light from the space. Dana White announces the new main event for UFC 200, Brock Lesnar vs. Mark Hunt. Jon Jones has been pulled for a potential anti-doping violation. The room is deathly silent. White answers a few questions, but is unable to offer much clarity to the situation, then brings out Daniel Cormier to speak. Daniel Cormier is in pain, his anguish palpable. Even the sound of journalists typing seemed to fade as he struggled to express the grief of losing this bout and all its requisite glory and gain once more before it's even fought. Leading up to this fight, so many of us felt exhausted and unexcited by such a compelling matchup, and it wasn't because it wasn't a good fight, it's a great fight, but because this is our 4th time approaching Cormier vs. Jones, and our 3rd time seeing it dissolve before they enter the cage. We stumbled back to our rooms with the news, working late into the night to scrape out details, as much concrete information as could be found, and deliberated on what was next. At 8 a.m. the next morning, we were back in that same press room, listening to Jon Jones now, with his vows of integrity and apologies to his fans and to Cormier. Suddenly, Jones disappeared from the room. I looked over at him in the doorway to the back passages of the MGM. When he returns, his face is contorted, noticeably more troubled now. Unable to continue without tears. None of this seemed real last night, but it certainly seemed more real now, as we all sit here in silence, watching Jon Jones cry. I thought of the years of suspension Jones will face for this violation. What should be the golden age of Jon Jones's career now floated in limbo awaiting a B sample test which would ultimately fail as well. Again, we're faced with more questions than answers. Will we ever see Jon Jones in the octagon again? By 10 a.m., we had run back to the T-Mobile Arena. The open workout was now only Mark Hunt and Brock Lesnar, well, actually only Mark Hunt, who hit mitts with full plastics on, making me wonder how much weight he would need to cut to make the heavyweight limit tomorrow. Lesnar declined to work out, instead choosing to hold a short question and answer session where Lesnar kept chuckling to himself, repeating the phrase, "Merry Christmas to Brock," and calling Jon Jones unprofessional. More on that later. The midpoint of the day is the UFC 202 press conference for the rematch between Conor McGregor and Nate Diaz, originally scheduled for this Saturday, but now mid-August. It starts nearly an hour late, but it does eventually begin. It's much of the same banter, but with an extra dose of chaos, as the center of the stage and even our media section seemed to be in a weird pocket where the audio was just mushy echoes. It was impossible to understand anything anyone said. Somehow, McGregor was able to hear and answered a few questions, but Diaz, unable to make out any of the comments, began to tune out. I suppose, afraid of potential fisticuffs, White intervened in the face-off before much could happen. Even so, the crowd roared. Despite no belt being on the line here, McGregor sported his featherweight title anyway. Next, it's the Ultimate Fighter finale weigh-ins. And outside of the main event, I am most looking forward to the Women's Ultimate Fighter finale match between fellow Southern Californian Tatiana Suarez and Invicta alumna Amanda Cooper. Jacek and Gedalia had too much animosity to square off in a traditional manner. At this point, they are just ready to fight. No more hype needed. It's fight night number 1, and let's kick it off with Anthony Burchak showing me where his bone had split through the skin of his broken thumb. Yay! There were some grueling, very fun bouts. Then Derek Lewis proceeded to knock every bead of sweat out of Roy Nelson's beard. In the first of 3 main events, I expected a war. Alvarez was in many of my all-time favorite bouts, and Dos Anjos had so handily taken care of would-be usurpers in the past, it was hard to imagine how he would be unseated. But after stuffing a few takedown attempts, Alvarez rocked Dos Anjos, who began to stumble backwards along the fence, absorbing punishment while still doling a few strikes of his own, but ultimately succumbing to a barrage of punches. Alvarez walked away, shaking his head, celebrating quietly, face overwhelmed by emotion. Staring down at that shiny new belt as if this was still a dream, hitting his forehead in disbelief, it was all finally accomplished after all of the time spent in contract turmoil and then one of the toughest runs to the title of any fighter. Here is Eddie Alvarez, the new UFC lightweight champion. Back in the press room, Anderson Silva spoke to media, now stepping in to face Daniel Cormier. At the press conference, Alvarez called a potential match with McGregor an easy fight compared to the true best in the world like Dos Anjos. And after the post-presser, a handshake between competitors, honor among pugilists. And Derek Lewis, steadily climbing up the ranks at heavyweight, caressed Alvarez's new belt with such lust. Our first night of fights this week ends with a new champion. Congratulations, Eddie Alvarez. We're up and at 'em for the last of the morning weigh-ins before breakfast. Sage Northcutt is the first to hit the scale, and in the new procedure, fighters are given a 2-hour window in which to weigh, and most fighters will show up in the first half hour, ready to get this whole business over with. As the clock neared 10 a.m., the bantamweight champ had not yet appeared. Finally, at the wire, Miesha Tate arrives and makes weight. There was a collective sigh of relief in the room as Tate stepped off the scale. Without fanfare, the UFC had made Tate versus Nunes the new main event, so if Tate had not arrived in time, another main event would have been cancelled this week. I've photographed at least a dozen of Tate's weigh-ins, and she had never had to break out the towel to make weight before. She looked harrowed and drained. We were at the ceremonial weigh-ins a few hours later, where for the most part, there were no surprises. We saw Lesnar remove his shirt for the first time this week, and he still looked very much a monster. His physique filled the giant display behind him menacingly. And perhaps in some attempt to drum up some extra interest in the bout, Champ Tate tepidly engages with the challenger Nunes to evoke uproar or some kind of mild panic in Dana White. But when they face forward, both are smiling, especially Nunes, who seems to have written off all that nonsense. Time to run back to the MGM Grand. It's fight night, again. And the Korean Superboy took care of business so quickly that all I have is this adorable shot of him as he's leaving the cage in victory. And strawweight Tatiana Suarez proved her dominance by crushing her castmate Amanda Cooper to become the next Ultimate Fighter. Now it was time for my personal pick of Fight of the Week. The rematch between Jędrzejczyk and Gadelha. It exceeded my expectations with immediate drama as the champ was knocked down in the first and spent much of the early rounds on her back or defending takedowns. But if any particular facet of Claudinha's game was a question, it would be cardio, as the heavily muscled Brazilian had never been to a fifth round. And it was in the championship rounds that the Polish striker excelled. Midway through the third, Jędrzejczyk began to turn the tide and Gadelha spent time between rounds under bags of ice, gulping in air. Both women fought valiantly, powering through all that pain and fatigue with every bit of themselves. Many fighters will tell you their worst fear, the worst agony in a fight is that of exhaustion. In the end, the champion remained, elbowing and kicking her way back to the winner's podium. And while that warm game Joanna more respect the blogging, the Brazilian said she would only respect her as a fighter and would reserve her right to dislike Joanna, the person. Jędrzejczyk remained complimentary to her vanquished challenger. On the second night of fights is over. In a few hours, we'll be at the T-Mobile Arena instead of the Grand Garden Arena, so the crew began to take down the champions' banners around the press room. We blearily shuffled back to our rooms to ready for the big 200. It's fight night number 3, and the opening bout is Jim Miller versus Takanori Gomi. That could easily headline any fight night. Needless to say, there were so many good fights and so much action, I'm kinda tired. But I'm no less excited for the night ahead and curious how this momentous night will end. TJ Dillashaw avenges that controversial split decision loss to Assunção resoundingly. And Juliana Pena mashes former title contender Kat Zingano. Other than the yellow mat and the projection screens, I'd say UFC 200 didn't seem too different or have that grandeur of last summer's UFC 189 floating pedestal with Sinead O'Connor. But that doesn't take away from my enjoyment or enthusiasm for the displays of grit and skill in combative arts. And it certainly didn't hinder the crowd's joy in seeing the return of Cain Velasquez to the winning column. To tell you why I love this image so much, I'm just going to read you what Daniel Cormier wrote about this photo. I've actually been here before. This is the look when you realize everything that everybody has said about Cain going super hard is true. But not only true, it's worse than you could imagine. All you can think is, oh my goodness, he's still coming forward. Travis Brown's a bad dude. It's just that Cain is the absolute best. I hardly have time to process the images or even process the fights in my mind as Jose Aldo runs to the cage to claim the interim featherweight title. It's a valiant effort by Edgar, but Aldo was faster, more nimble than I remember. It was both a return to the Aldo before he was UFC champ and a new Jose Aldo, a blade resurfaced and resharpened. Daniel Cormier ran to the cage too, busting right past the cameraman and rounding this corner, spotlight barely catching up. On just a few days' notice, there should only be one game plan for a great wrestler facing a great striker, and Cormier followed it to a T, though I'm not sure if he expected Anderson Silva to spend most of the time not trying to get up, but simply in a stalling lockdown position on the light heavyweight champ. The crowd began to boo. Cormier tries to make more space to rain more strikes, but Silva continues to stall. The fans become unruly. It's so incredibly disrespectful. TJ Dillashaw said when he had to face Joe Soto on 24 hours notice, he lost all his drive to fight and it made it so difficult to put his heart into the violence. John Jones didn't finish an outmatched and injured last-minute replacement in Ovince St. Preux. It's like everyone forgot Silva versus Maia or Silva versus Leitchis. They forgot that it takes two to tango and it's not always the wrestler on top making it a boring struggle. I became irate. I felt like jumping into the stands to fight someone. After all Cormier had been through this week, to be booed this way. I focused my attention on Brock Lesnar emerging from the tunnel. This fight was similar in that it was takedown after takedown, kind of the way you think that Brock Lesnar would win a bout against a decapitation master like Mark Hunt. Fans didn't boo nearly as much. Lesnar grinds down Hunt to a win in his big return to the UFC, then tightly grips Sable's hand as he pulls her out of the octagon with him like some kind of primitively carnal prize. The night was speeding by and suddenly it was the main event. I watched the challenger Amanda Nunes round the cage to her corner. Across from Nunes, the champ roared, charging herself up to thwart the lioness across from her. When the fight was announced and I saw how many people were writing off Nunes, I thought, this is how it will happen. And when Nunes stuffed Tate's first takedown, my heart began to pound. From where I was positioned, I saw mostly the referee's backside and fence and post as Nunes chased the hurt and panicked Tate around the cage. When the champ sat down as she backed into the cage and I saw her face bloodied already, the comeback kid didn't seem like she was gonna come back. The lioness was seconds away from catching her prey. A submission technically finished the fight, but Tate was done long before Nunes had her back. Her nose looked shattered, poured blood as she clutched victorious Nunes in what I think is an embrace. Nunes was overwhelmed with emotion, cried in every direction. So many doubted her, but here she was, carried by those who knew better. Cried as the belt was placed on her, cried as she bent over to touch its gold surface, hands running across the culmination of her efforts. When Nunes emerged from the cage, the new champ, she handed the belt to her sister on the phone to family as she clutched the UFC bantamweight title, screaming in joy. Brock Lesnar does what Brock Lesnar wants. So Brock Lesnar gets his own post-fight press conference where he affably answered a few questions, but certainly the big question that loomed could not be answered here. Would not be answered for a few weeks as we waited the results of USADA's drug tests. Lesnar would test positive for an estrogen blocker in and out of competition, one of the same substances as Jon Jones. But Lesnar won his prize already and is undoubtedly just enjoying life in Regina, Saskatchewan, without concern. After Lesnar leaves, we're back on this high. UFC 200 wasn't the exact night of fights we had originally set out for, but it was nonetheless triumphant in so many ways. And it was so sweet to see all of the love across the dais as fighters embraced their friends, warmed in the glow of a nice payday on a hot summer night. In the end, affection and friendship will last longer than the glory in the cage, and the look between Velasquez and Cormier is priceless. What they have, sweating, bleeding, bruising together, is this deeply physically shared understanding of the trials of such a life. The week was such a roller coaster for Cormier, but at least he is sitting aside his friend, both as winners tonight. Midway through, former bantamweight champ Miesha Tate joins the panel, face obscured behind a towel keeping blood from dripping out. I've always applauded Tate's pride as a fighter. She could have declined to come to the post-fight, but here she is, answering questions after such a devastating and damaging loss. When asked about the support from her partner, fellow UFC fighter Nina Ansaroff, Nunes glowed about Ansaroff being the best training partner she's ever had in her life. Ansaroff began to tear up as she smiled back at the accolades Nunes poured upon her in this crowded media tent. Nunes responded to a question about her being the first openly gay champion in the UFC that it's amazing, but the most important thing is that she's happy with her life. As the night came to an end, the new UFC bantamweight champion brought the shining belt to her face, smiled like a child pleasantly dreaming, happy with everything in her life coming together in this perfect way. It made my eyes well up with such pride. It was a beautiful night, and Nunes' win gave me hope for the future, hope for inclusivity and sensitivity. I'm still so amazed at how our collective appreciation and participation in this brutal contest of prize fighting lends itself to these moments. This is it. These nights of triumph and pain that end in an embrace of this grueling, masochistic, and ultimately cathartic quest to the top. This is Esther Lynn for MMAfighting.com, and thank you for watching.